So 20 years ago, when we were doing these small team Agile things, we were building local applications on web servers or phones that weren't tightly integrated. They weren't huge, broad applications. They were things a single team could actually solve for in the marketplace. And we controlled the environment they could deploy into, and we controlled access to it. So some things have changed. We're dealing with a number of clients, and I run into this all the time with people that are trying to do Agile the way they understand Agile to be and what's important about it, and how it's actually causing really negative effects in organizations and causing lots of backlash inside of organizations against what they're doing. Working with one of our firms that is trying to launch a new product into the cloud, and the IT organization, the development organization, in fact, not even the whole IT organization, the development organization is trying to do really small team, autonomous Agile, sort of make it up as you go. They're trying to launch a brand new cloud native application. And what's happening is they've made promises to the market when it's going to be delivered that they can't keep. It may have cost a CEO his job or contributed to a CEO losing his job in the organization because they said they'd have something done that isn't done. There's no transparency into the work that they're doing because they're operating with these independent teams that are really trying to do Agile the way they understand it to be done and the way they used to do it in the past, where the delivery teams just get in the room and work as hard as they can to solve a problem. The challenges that come out of their understanding of Agile and how Agile has changed is none of those individual teams can actually deliver this product to the market. It's a large application with lots of dependencies between pieces. It's drawing from some existing software. They want to run these teams that are just empower the team, let the team do the best they can, create total autonomy amongst the teams. And the teams may be being productive locally, but in fact they're not, because they've had to restructure their approach 5 times in the last 5 months and are kind of starting on round 5 of how they're approaching solving this problem, because they're operating in a vacuum, separate from the market, separate from the customers, separate from the way they're going to deploy it and run it, separate from how they're going to monitor it and support it. They don't know how they're going to actually put it into their data center to be able to support their customers, or how they're going to convert current customers into the existing application. Like, there are big, complex problems that need to be sorted out by the organization, and the delivery teams that are trying to do Agile right want to operate in a vacuum. So this concept of Agile calls for just trust the teams, close to the problem, let them sort it out, is interesting if the conditions exist for those teams to operate autonomously and the entire ecosystem of problems is in some sort of a controlled circumstance. So 20 years ago, when we were doing these small team Agile things, we were building local applications on web servers or phones that weren't tightly integrated. They weren't huge, broad applications. They were things a single team could actually solve for in the marketplace. And we controlled the environment they could deploy into, and we controlled access to it. So some things have changed. One of them is the complexity of the solutions is much broader. An individual team can't launch these things independently. One developer, a small team of developers, can't build these high impact things and put them into the market independently in most organizations, because the problem spaces are just too big. The concepts of omni-channel, it's got to look the same across 20 or 30 different platforms and interfaces. It's got to have common user experience. The omni-channel of methods of deploying information have caused a lot of complexity. It's got to work on my phone, on all my browsers, on my integrated kiosks, causes a lot of challenges. The other thing is security requirements have changed. It's got to be unhackable. It's got to be totally protected. It's got to be able to run without being, without being violated, and the data can all be protected. The other thing that's changed is it's got to be performant at scale in ways that it can't be. In the mid 80s, I was writing an application that ran on handhelds to collect data, published websites that connected to an Oracle database, drew data from a financial services application, but the application itself was like totally autonomous, and I could build that with a small team of people and design it. Today, the financial services things we're building are way more complicated. The amount of functionality that's being deployed can't be built by a single team in a short period of time. There's 4 or 5 years worth of application to build if they build it all from scratch on a single team. So you got to put 8 or 10 teams on it. Those things will have to work well together. I totally controlled my environment. I was deploying it on Apache, on a Linux box that I totally controlled, and then writing C++ code on the handhelds to do data gathering. Totally controlled the environment. Today, you can't just let everybody build on the environment the way they want to. All that stuff could be hacked and violated. There were ways that I found through my own application where I could actually get into the Oracle database and get customer names and phone numbers that we closed off as we were going. Today, you can't figure that out later. That all has to be protected up front. There's just a number of things that are very different in building these large applications that Agile as a standalone team thing is going to fail. And so what we're looking at is how do you create speed and autonomy in pockets and create the conditions so teams can move fast, and how do you do that in a way that you can orchestrate all these different pieces, concurrently emerging them so you can move to the market quickly with a new product. So there's a class of problem around this, which is in a new product space where we're trying to go to the cloud, do something cloud native, roll it out, and we're doing it in a way where we're paying attention maybe to the code, maybe to the user experience, but not taking the whole ecosystem into account, and people are running into problems. What happens when we do that is the product people, the business people making investments, the people that are on the hook for making promises to the market, making promises to investors, making promises to customers, they're all getting hung out to dry because they don't have an answer or something to present to the customer early enough. Now, maybe this doesn't happen everywhere, but every place that I'm walking into is having massive problems with their Agile implementations failing because the conditions don't exist for them to operate as autonomous teams, but the teams insist on operating like all that other overhead just gets in the way. I've got a few clients that we're going into now where their Agile transformations have failed. And to talk about Agile or transformation creates a visceral reaction from senior executives, people that are coming in behind stakeholders that made big investments into this Agile stuff, and because they wanted to run Agile 2001, totally autonomous, independent teams, making up their mind as they go, totally independent, or that's how the market maybe has interpreted it. It might not even be what the founders or the originators of the manifesto intended, by the way. But the way it's interpreted and sold in the market is these independent, autonomous teams solving problems directly with the market. Because it was installed that way, now nobody wants to do Agile. So there are things that are absolutely necessary around relatively persistent autonomous teams operating to solve problems together. That's absolutely necessary. But that gets thrown out with the bad Agile, which is, and that's sufficient to solve big complex problems in organizations. We've got things like we don't want to have well-formed backlogs. We just want to figure it out as we're going almost in real time because it's impossible to know where we're going. That's like some Agile beliefs. Well, that is not successful. We are building a roadmap for a client who's launching a major product, and we're going, if you want to launch this functionality by this date into the market, these are the pieces of functionality that must be deployable and ready to go by this date. Let's go figure out how to make that happen on the ground with our teams. That overhead is necessary, but it's viewed as constricting the dynamic flexibility of the delivery teams. There's big conflict in the organization around it. But those same delivery teams haven't been able to create the conditions where everything that's necessary for a team to be able to do is available to those teams. So they want the world to be a way, but it's not that way. And then they get frustrated when we add this overhead to the circumstance. So that sort of sense of We can't talk about Agile. Agile's failing. The product organization is rejecting Agile as a way of solving problems. Like, this isn't isolated. This is literally conversations with 4 different clients this week where the way that teams are trying to do Agile is in conflict with the actual problem space that they're in, has led to poor results in the market or with stakeholders or with their partners in the organization, and Agile itself is getting rejected because of it. So what we find in a lot of these organizations is that they want to go back to what they did before. I don't know why we changed it. Let's go back to what we did before because it seemed to be working pretty well. We'll go back to big upfront, complete requirements phases, and we'll go back to project-based teams, and we'll go back to heavy orchestration, working on all these things since we can't do them concurrently, we'll do them linearly. And they want to go back to something because they feel like in retrospect it worked, but there was a reason why they were shifting away from what they were doing before. They couldn't get to market fast enough. It's impossible to get the requirements defined quickly. The giant batching of stuff introduces too much risk in to deploy everything late. We had a client that built a music player that was a great music player, but it was delivered 2 years after the market had other music players, and they spent $100 million on something that actually never got any traction. They couldn't even give it away to attract people to their products. So the old model of getting everything defined up front, project-based teams, tracking the Gantt chart, all the activities, that doesn't work either. So there's something in between completely autonomous teams and perfect definition up front. But it only works if we have the right conditions in place. And I'm just going to throw this in. So I don't know if I might mess this up a little bit, but I'm going to go back like half a step, let you pull it back in. But the other thing that happens is not only does so they're either going back to what they did before, they want to go back to the way they did project-based organizations in the past because that worked, but it worked from a knowing where things were standpoint notionally, but it actually didn't. It gave the perception that they had control over things, but it was way too slow. It didn't create options. It wasn't adaptable enough. So the other thing you see people doing is trying to invest in giant technology plays, digital transformation, DevOps, doing other types of tangential agile things, which are probably important, going to the cloud native stuff. All of that works, services-based architectures, microservices-based architectures. All those are things that people are going to because of the promise that it will provide this adaptability that they're looking for. And those are probably better paths to them. They're completely insufficient to actually solve the problem. So we've seen a lot of organizations spend tons and tons and tons of money on building out cloud or building out DevOps organizations or building out new product management innovation centers. The reason why those things don't work is that while those are necessary, they're insufficient to actually get where we're going. We need to find that sweet spot, which is sufficiently stable, persistent organizational structures that are built to be composable to the next set of problems that are there. So one of the things that we did back in the 2000s, we were doing capability-based organization designs. What are the capabilities of your product? How do you align those around problems? How do you create relatively persistent teams in those spaces? And how do you identify within those capabilities what the subset of problems are that you need to solve to connect to a strategy? Like, that's necessary. That requires an organizational design and a way of articulating strategy as a set of outcomes and performance improvements, not specific requirements. We can do high-level roadmaps of those types of problems, of the gaps that need to be closed to solve the problem. We can create relatively persistent teaming structures that are aligned with those roadmaps, and then using those stable teams and some agile methods, empowered by or enabled by the right types of automation through DevOps and the CI/CD, which is probably sort of in that space, and a deeper understanding of our customer and building and exploring options, getting our entire slice of the organization to be able to deliver with some frequency. and the ability to create feedback and get to done frequently, we can solve this problem. But you can't solve it with the individual pieces. It's a cohesive whole. And some of these things take a long time to get there. So what do you do in the 2 to 3 years it takes to get your organization completely able to adapt? You've got to go after slices of the organization. You've got to put some heavy orchestration and governance and option management around those parts of the organization that can't move as fast as you want to. You've got to be very intentional about moving your complexity to a known place and investing in managing that complexity where it exists. So what we don't want to do is build these autonomous teams that inject lots and lots and lots of complexity into the organization. It's unbounded in time and value to the market. It's unpredictable. You don't know when they're going to deliver things. And the complexity in the white space is going to be self-organized in real time by these teams. That just doesn't work unless you have a level of autonomy in the architecture and the technologies and the deployment and the data and the customer contracts and the marketing. Unless that level of autonomy exists across all aspects of that, funding, contracts, procurement, you can't have those things self-organized, the dependencies. So what we're looking at is, what does it look like to create relatively persistent teaming structures, aligned with value propositions and the capabilities necessary to deliver those value propositions to customers? What does it look like to create as much autonomy as you can inside your current constraints, and then intentionally move the complexity of orchestration into a very clearly determined decision model so you can manage those dependencies? This concept of I'm a CEO and I need my technology to be adaptive, but it's so complicated and overwhelming, I can't possibly know all of the details of the technology. So I just have to trust the organization to figure it out. And Agile tells me just to trust my teams, and servant leadership tells me just to create the conditions they need, and all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, I've got to hit numbers, and I've got to keep customers happy, and I've got to make things move. And I don't understand how the things I'm trying to move are enabled or threatened by the decisions I'm making. Like you guys have to build a system that can respond to the market the way that I need it to. And we haven't explained what the impact is of shoving work into a sprint and why that doesn't actually give the executive what he wants more of. But it's the way he had to do it in the past because he didn't have a stable system. So there has to be some shift in what's going on. So how do we begin to take those conversations apart? There's this thing I'm working with, which is around the influence trust loop. And it's like on the influence side. And it starts out with on the access side. When we go to talk to that CEO on that access side, how do we show up? And who does he think we're showing up? What conversation is he having? When we show up and we're having the conversation, like we're going to talk about sprints and DevOps and cloud and all these fancy technical things, I think it happens on purpose to make it sound, to be able to deflect accountability sometimes in the complexity of it. But what we want to be able to do is show up as a partner of the CEO trying to solve that problem. I'm desperately trying to understand what my organization needs to look like that can respond to the market the way that I need it to. Because I have commitments I have to make to the market. I have customers that need to buy something next week that we didn't plan for before. I don't have a system that I understand the impact of the decisions I'm making. I don't have transparency into the impact. I don't want to understand any of the technical details or the granularity of it. But if given better information and more transparency, I would make better decisions. But we don't provide that. So the impact of making that decision is these other 3 things are going to get bumped back by 2 weeks. Or I can, if we can make these 5 things be true, I can deliver that to you. Or here's 3 alternatives to achieve what you want to achieve to solve for it. We don't have the conversation in the options and transparency that the executive needs to get there. So we show up from an access standpoint as someone who has a technical specialty they're trying to play, not as somebody who's trying to solve the problem the CEO is trying to solve. There's an empathy part of it where we don't have deep empathy for the challenges and problems and the impact that decisions that we've made in the past, the information we've provided in the past, have caused to that CEO or that executive. I've made promises to customers before based on what you're telling you did not deliver. I'm not going to trust you this time. We moved really fast last time. You told me we could, but we're still fixing the bugs and the defects. We still can't get it installed to the client and get them to accept it and pay for it. So we're not having empathy for the classes of challenges. And so without that empathy, we don't know how to help them form a different point of view on how they can participate to achieve the things that are most important to them, right? They think we're trying to push our agenda with low empathy, so we don't want to change their viewpoints. This concept of, let's talk a little bit about what you've experienced, what we told you in the past, how what we're doing this time is different, and I need you to support that difference to give you a different outcome. Because if we keep doing the same things, we're going to get the same result. But I can't do this other thing without you participating. So this concept of we need to be able to have some capacity to deal with things that come in. And if we overbook our capacity, we can't be immediately fungible. Here are 3 options you can have when something comes up late that we haven't planned for. I don't need you to understand scrums or stand-ups or stories or features or epics. I need to be able to give patterns of thinking and then make a system that can respond to that's coming in, that matter to the CEO. I need optionality. I need clarity. I need to understand the impact of the decisions I'm making. I don't like the constraints that are being put on me by this. Well, then here's 3 options to change those constraints, right? So how do we begin to understand what these executives or the PMO or the product person or the operations person, or what do we need to understand what matters to them. We need to understand how they've reached their conclusions about what matters to them and show them how what we're doing is different, but not how it makes us more adaptable and more flexible and easier for development. We need to have these things create the optionality and transparency and success for the things that matter to the person we're dealing with. And then we have to go put together a way that we're going to prove it, create safety for them to go try it in a slice. Just take a strongly held belief about why what we're doing is crazy, turn it into a weakly held belief that they might consider an alternative, then give them a way to go explore that thing and see if we can't together do something that still meets their need, and then we can go deliver to it. So the trust side is about delivering on that promise. What we want to do is we want to walk in and try to create these influence conversations from a point of competence. We have the right answer. We've solved it. If you would just listen to me, trust me, give me this stuff, let me go run with it. Like, we're trying to do it from a competence side, but that competence isn't tied to something they believe. You know, one of the things that we'll hear all the time is, okay, you're right, but what would you do if they don't believe that? What do you do if they don't believe that? Like, what if you don't have agency to do it? What if they don't believe you? Even if you're right, what can you do about it? We have to go back down. There's a thing called the ladder of inference that's in my mind a lot, which is, why do they believe what they believe? Because they're not intentionally trying to do something destructive. They're trying to protect their interest and things that they're responsible for and do the right things for themselves, their family, their organization. So why do they believe what they're doing is in the best interest of that? And if it's in fact not, how do we start to have a conversation that goes after their observations and their assumptions and their history? Because we can't just start telling them they're wrong, or it's going to create more and more resistance. Major problem we have is this condescending, managers are bad, executives are bad in our industry, not us personally. Sort of, you don't know what you're talking about, just listen to me. But then we go and we don't deliver on it. Like, this is why all these Agile things end up rejecting in organizations and making the Agile stuff be harder to do in the future, because we didn't show up with empathy for the problem of critical stakeholders, and we didn't show them how they participate, their observations, their understanding of what they do is impacted by the decisions they're making. It isn't about if we just did stand-ups better, or if we just did TDD, or we just wrote tests better, or we just had better DevOps. Like none of that is interesting to the executives. We're not having the right conversations. So what we know, and there are some clear patterns, we draw this a lot. We're going to why does a project manager PMO group want to do project-based staffing? Because it drives utilization and they're responsible for utilization. But what if that project-based staffing is actually causing things to cost more and causing delays? Because it does sometimes, but it doesn't always. So we make these blanket comments. We fight about you're wrong, I'm right. Having a conversation at the very top of that inference ladder or from a competence point of view. And so our ideas get rejected. But if we could explore the impact of rework, maybe start to build some data around rework or churn or delay or overbuilding, start to find some evidence that we could use as we do the work to show them the cost. Tell them, what if I could reduce delay by half on this project you've got, reducing the time to market by half of these projects? What if I could do that? Let me show you what it looks like. So we start to move them in a direction of a new set of beliefs. But here's what else is really interesting to me, and I think it's critically important in this conversation is, as we're having those viewpoint conversations and understand their conditions and their situations and their constraints, our approaches have to be tailored more intentionally towards those real constraints. Because we can't just go in and say, well, I can't form stable teams. I'm using vendors. I can't change that. I have 43 things I have to deliver, and it's just real. We can't go, well, I wish it wasn't real. If it wasn't real, you could solve this. Like, we have to be able to go in and say, okay, in those conditions, what's the best way to deal with solving that problem? There's patterns. I think there's patterns to the solution, and I think there's patterns to the reframing. I'm working with James Maxwell, and we're calling it inference hacking. Like there's a ladder of inference, like inference mapping. What do you believe and why do you believe it? And there's inference hacking. How do we change it? I think there's some really clear patterns to the inference hacking, but I think in that inference hacking is some discipline on what does it look like to make the right sort of trade-off decisions to solve the problem. But it's in that space of aligning empathy, viewpoint, and creating safety. It's in that space that all these conflicts have to be addressed. It's not going to be addressed by shoving stuff down people's throats. It's not going to be addressed by wishing the world was different and putting in patterns of things that don't solve problems. So DevOps is a competence solution. But how does DevOps help me achieve more dollars in my market, or deliver my promises to my stakeholders, or increase my security? Like those things matter to me. I don't need to understand the technicality of DevOps. I need to understand how to think about it and what conditions we have to create for DevOps to give me the thing that matters to me, and then let me participate in it. So it's about creating this different conversation on the influence side, not about having the right answer. And I think that's a critical gap that's missing in many of our consultants, in the industry, but generally with experts. They want to walk in with the right answer, and they don't want to deal with the empathy. Well, it's stupid that you worry about that. That's the wrong thing to care about. Utilization is the wrong thing to care about. Why do you care about utilization? Because it's my job to make sure we're spending our money most efficiently in the organization. So there are some cases where utilization is the right measure for that. But there are some where it probably isn't. Let me give you an example of where having a critical knowledge-based skill, or a developer, or somebody, a subject matter expert, working on 37 things at the same time is going to cost you money over time. So it's true sometimes, it's not true sometimes. Here's some conditions where it might not be true. How do you want to understand this problem and think about it differently? Could we try an experiment? Like, that's a whole path of getting to the underlying beliefs and then proving it in a way that it benefits the stakeholder. It changes how you show up. It changes your access to the next conversation and increases your influence, because you're sitting there trying to partner to solve their problems. And I think when we show up as experts, a lot of times, we don't show up as trusted partners.